Hola chicos y bienvenidos a otro vídeo. En este vídeo vamos a estar hablando de las comparaciones. Ya veo, I already see here before we begin already a typo. That's not the best start, but let's make sure the spelling is correct. So, comparaciones de igualdad. Okay, so this video has to do with comparisons of similar things, right? Or basically equal things. So in the previous video that you watched about comparisons, we talked about how one thing, one person, one place, two nouns basically can be different, right? So we used más, we used menos. In this video, we're going to talk about how something can be just as description as something else. So instead of saying Spanish is more difficult than French, we could say French is just as difficult as, let's say, Latin, right? So just as. And also we're going to get into how to say basically as much as, right? So let's look at the first option. So this is the formula, okay? If I want to say that something is just as a certain quality as something else, this is the formula. You start with tan, right? Or actually you start with two things, okay? So if I have, for example, let's do some examples here. So if I have, por ejemplo, el español, right? Let's compare Spanish with a different language, okay? And let's take French, el francés, okay? If I want to say that Spanish is just as difficult as French, then I need to follow this formula. Okay, so I start with the first concept, or the first thing that we're comparing. So I say el español, right, Spanish, es, right, it is, and next I need the word tan. Tan is kind of like the más or the menos, but it's just one word because it means just as. It's not better, worse, less, more, it's just as. So el español es tan, then what? Adjetivo or adverbio? Those are the two choices. So an adjetivo we know will modify a noun, right? So el español es tan, and I want to use the verb, or rather the adjective, difícil, right? That's the adjective that I'm using, difícil. And then what comes after is the word como, right? So instead of que, we're using como, which means as, more than, it's as. Como el francés, right? El español es tan difícil como el francés. Spanish is just as difficult as French. So, again, what we have here is a formula. Two things. One is just as, right, something as the other. So, tan plus adjetivo plus como gives you the idea or the comparison that you want of igualdad. Now, adverbio, we know, is not an adjective, but an adverb. It tells us how something is done. So we would use a verb in that case. So if I want to say, for example, that I speak Spanish just as well as my friend Javier, I would say, yo hablo, right? So we have the verb there, el español, or hablo español. Tan is the next, and then I need an adverb, right? So it's not bueno because bueno is good, not well, it's bien. Como, right, is the next important word, mi amigo Javier, okay? So again, instead of saying I am better at Spanish, I could say, or rather I speak, or I am just as good at Spanish as Javier, I could say I speak just as well. That's why we're using an adverb here. So again, this is the formula. Tan, adjetivo or adverbio, como, and that's how we get just as. So here's some examples. Las uvas son tan deliciosas como las manzanas, right? Grapes are just as tan deliciosas, and remember deliciosas matches up with uvas, como las manzanas. El baloncesto es tan rápido como el lacrosse. el español es tan difícil como el francés. Okay? Now, we're going then, after we have just as, to the idea of as much as. So instead of saying that one thing is just as, again, using description as something else, this allows us to talk about quantity, right? Cantidad de cosas. So it's like if you were to say, you know, my class or my Spanish class has just as many students as my math class, right? This is the formula. Tanto is the word that we use. Tanto gives us as much as, right? Then we add a noun, either a singular or a plural noun, and then we add como. So let's go to that idea of Spanish class, okay? So if I want to say my period 2 class has just as many students as my period 5 class, this is what it would look like. So I would say, mi clase de periodo 2, right, tiene, it has, and now I want to say it has the same amount of alumnos, right? Now, tanto needs to change to match up with alumnos, okay? Now, because tanto modifies alumnos, the endings need to match up. So instead of tanto, I'm going to have tantos. Let's say I were talking about female students. Alumnas, right? I have the same amount of female students. Tantos, or tanto originally would go to tantas, right? Alumnas, and then the keyword is como, right? Mi clase de periodo 5, right? So we're comparing two things in terms of here number, right? Quantity of things, to say as much as. So again, instead of saying this is just as difficult, or English is just as difficult as French, I'm saying English has as many or as much, as many speakers as Spanish, right? So we're going from kind of a, what we would call a qualitative comparison, right? Comparing two things based on their qualities and their characteristics to two things that we're comparing in terms of their number, right? So let's look at some examples. Yo comí tanta comida como él. I ate just as much food as him, as he did, rather. So, tanta, look, it matches up with comida. Trabajo, yo hice tanto trabajo como mi hermano. Tanto is going to match up with trabajo, right? See, look at the O's. Tanto, trabajo. And then we have tantos with verbos. El español tiene tantos verbos irregulares como el francés. So you see the difference? In all of these cases, tanto is the original, let's say, word that we need. So tanto is going to be in all of these, right? Because we're comparing different numbers, or the same numbers, really, as much as. And so what you're going to have to do is, according to the thing that you're comparing, right, these nouns, you need to change tanto accordingly. So trabajo makes tanto, tanto. It stays the same. Comida, because it's singular and it's feminine, is tanta. Verbos is going to be tantos. And look how como stays the same. That never changes. Okay? So in review, what you need to take into consideration is that here, instead of calling things completely different, we're calling them basically the same. So we're saying one thing is just as hard, just as easy, just as, let's see, just as quick, just as slow, just as tall, just as short as something else, right? And then when we use tanto and como, we're talking about one thing having or one thing doing something as much as someone or something else. So this is just again a brief look rather at the way that we can compare two things that are really similar. Okay, and we call these comparaciones de igualdad. Vale. Si tienes una pregunta, por favor, podemos hablar en clase de cualquier yo no sé, cualquier preocupación que tienes. ¿Vale? Hasta la próxima. Adiós.